The word landed like a slap across the private dining room where 38 people had gathered to celebrate my brother Ryan's engagement to Madison Lancaster. Pathetic, she'd said, loud enough that conversations at 3 nearby tables stopped mid-sentence. That's the only word for someone who teaches middle school English at 32 and still rents a studio apartment. Claire, honey, some of us actually have ambition. Laughter rippled through the crowd, sharp, knowing laughter from people who'd spent the evening discussing their impressive careers, their investment portfolios, their vacation homes in Aspie, and the Hamptons. I sat frozen with a glass of wine I no longer wanted to drink, wearing the only cocktail dress I owned that I'd bought on clearance from Nordstrom Rack for $47. What Madison didn't know, what none of them knew except her father Richard, who sat at the head table with an expression I couldn't quite read, was that 3 days ago I'd made a decision that would transform this humiliation into the most awkward moment of Madison's carefully curated life. Drop a comment if you've ever been mocked for living modestly while doing meaningful work. This story is about the moment when assumptions met reality in the most spectacular way. My name is Claire Morrison. I'm 32 years old, and I've spent the past decade teaching 7th grade English at a public middle school in Boston, while watching my younger brother climb the corporate ladder and prepare to marry into exactly the kind of wealthy family that views teachers as failures who couldn't achieve real success. The Morrison family had always valued achievement, but my parents' definition of success had evolved as my brother Ryan's career had taken off. My father James was a CPA who'd built a comfortable practice. My mother Susan had worked as a paralegal before becoming a full-time parent. They'd raised Ryan and me with middle-class values about hard work, education, and contributing to society. But when Ryan had graduated from Wharton Business School at 24 and immediately landed a position at a prestigious consulting firm earning $140,000 annually, the family's understanding of appropriate career trajectories had shifted dramatically. His success had recalibrated their expectations, making my choice to become a teacher seem increasingly inadequate by comparison. Ryan, now 30, had continued his upward trajectory. Promotion to senior consultant, then manager, then senior manager, his salary climbing to $280,000 plus bonuses that often exceeded $100,000. He'd moved into a luxury apartment in Back Bay, drove a Tesla, vacationed in Europe twice annually, and cultivated a lifestyle that reflected what my parents had started calling real success. Meanwhile, I completed my master's in Education, taken a teaching position at Martin Luther King Jr. Middle School in Dorchester, and built a life around work I found meaningful, but that generated a $58,000 annual salary, and required living in a 450-square-foot studio apartment in Somerville that cost $1,800 monthly. The contrast in our lifestyles had been stark and consistent throughout our 20s. Ryan attended charity galas and networking events at venues that cost more for one evening than I spent on rent. I attended parent-teacher conferences and department meetings in a building with broken air conditioning and outdated textbooks. Claire's doing her service work became Mom's standard description of my career, her tone suggesting teaching was a phase I'd eventually outgrow rather than a profession requiring expertise, dedication, and daily navigation of challenges most people couldn't handle for a single week. The family dynamics had shifted further when Ryan had started dating Madison Lancaster 2 years ago. Madison came from the kind of wealth that made Ryan's success look modest. By comparison, her father Richard owned Lancaster Development, a real estate company that had built half the luxury condominiums in Boston over the past 20 years. The Lancaster family wealth was estimated at over $400 million. Madison herself worked in her father's company as vice president of marketing, a position that paid $180,000 annually, but that everyone understood was partly nepotism disguised as career achievement. She lived in a penthouse her father owned, drove a Range Rover he'd gifted her, and maintained a lifestyle funded by family wealth rather than personal accomplishment. But she carried herself as if her privilege was earned rather than inherited, and she'd made clear from the beginning of her relationship with Ryan that she viewed my teaching career as evidence of insufficient ambition rather than deliberate choice. "Your sister is a teacher?" had been Madison's first comment when Ryan introduced us 2 years ago, her tone making teacher sound like a euphemism for failure. That's so charitable of her. I could never work for such a modest salary. I'd feel like I wasn't living up to my potential. Hit that like button if you've watched someone confuse inherited privilege with personal achievement. You need to hear what her father said. The mockery had continued throughout Ryan and Madison's 2-year relationship. Family gatherings where Madison discussed her career achievements at Lancaster Development, while pointedly not asking about my work. Holiday celebrations where Madison's gifts were expensive and elaborate, while mine were modest and handmade because I'd spent my discretionary income on classroom supplies my school couldn't afford. Engagement celebration planning where Madison's guest list included people who matter professionally, while questioning whether my teacher colleagues would fit in with the crowd she wanted to attract. "Claire, I'm not trying to be rude," Madison had said during one particularly painful conversation about the engagement party guest list, "but your teacher friends aren't really on the same level as the people Ryan and I socialize with professionally. Maybe it's better if you come solo rather than bring in colleagues who might feel uncomfortable around successful people." Successful people. As if teaching middle school students who faced poverty, trauma, and systemic barriers wasn't success. As if helping 13-year-olds discover that reading could be transformative wasn't an achievement. As if choosing meaningful work over maximum salary wasn't a valid definition of success. The engagement dinner had been planned by Madison's mother, Catherine, for 6 weeks, a private dining room at one of Boston's most expensive restaurants, 38 guests including Lancaster family members, business associates, and the deed of social connections that Madison valued as proof of status and importance. The invitation had specified cocktail attire, which meant I'd spent $47 I couldn't easily afford on a dress that was still obviously discount compared to the designer clothing everyone else was wearing. I'd arrived alone, no teacher colleagues invited, no friends from my world of public education and social service, just me representing the Morrison family contingent that didn't quite measure up to Lancaster standards. The evening had been exactly what I'd expected. Conversations about real estate markets, investment strategies, vacation property management, and the kind of financial concerns that dominated the lives of people who'd never worried about king rent or choosing between buying groceries and purchasing classroom supplies. I'd been seated at a table with Ryan's work colleagues and their spouses, people who were polite but clearly uninterested in conversation with a middle school teacher who couldn't contribute to discussions about stock portfolios or property investments. I'd smiled through dinner, answered questions about my work with appropriate brevity, and tried to be present for my brother's celebration despite feeling completely out of place. But then Madison had decided that my presence alone wasn't sufficient humiliation. She needed to publicly establish the hierarchy that positioned me as the family failure whose modest life choices deserved mockery. The comment had come during the transition between dinner and toasts, when groups were mingling and conversation had become informal. I'd been standing near the bar, trying to decide whether to stay for toasts or leave early to avoid further discomfort, when Madison had approached with 3 of her friends, women whose designer dresses and expensive jewelry marked them as members of her social circle. "Claire, we were just discussing career choices," Madison had begun, her voice carrying that false sweetness people use when they're about to deliver criticism disguised as concern. I was explaining to my friends that not everyone is cut out for competitive professional environments. Some people are better suited to service careers that don't require the kind of ambition that drives real success. The friends had smiled, knowing smiles that suggested they'd discussed me before and found my career choices equally puzzling. "Teaching middle school must be so rewarding in non-financial ways," one of Madison's friends had added, her tone making rewarding sound like a consolation prize for people who couldn't achieve actual success. "It is rewarding," I'd replied evenly, trying to maintain dignity while recognizing I was being set up for public humiliation. "My students are pathetic," Madison had interrupted, her voice suddenly louder and sharper, drawing attention from nearby tables. That's the only word for someone who teaches middle school English at 32, and still rents a studio apartment. "Claire, honey, some of us actually have ambition. Some of us want more from life than correcting grammar and living paycheck to paycheck." The laughter that followed had been immediate and harsh, not just from Madison's friends but from Ryan's colleagues who'd overheard from Lancaster family members who'd turned to see what was funny, from 38 people who'd been given permission to mock the failure in the room. I'd stood there processing the public humiliation, watching my brother Ryan across the room doing absolutely nothing to defend me, seeing my parents' uncomfortable expressions that suggested embarrassment about my inadequacy, rather than outrage about Madison's cruelty. Comment stood, "If you've ever waited for family to defend you, and watched them choose silence instead. This moment revealed everything. But then Richard Lancaster had stood up at the head table, his movement drawing attention away from Madison's mockery, and toward the front of the room where he was reaching for his champagne glass. At 67, Richard was still imposing, tall, silver-haired, carrying the kind of natural authority that came from building a business empire over 4 decades. "Excuse me, everyone." Richard's voice carried easily across the private dining room, silencing the laughter that had followed Madison's comment. "Before we move to formal toast celebrating Ryan and Madison's engagement, I need to address something that requires immediate correction." The room had gone quiet, guests turning toward Richard with the kind of attention his wealth and status commanded. Madison had looked pleased, apparently assuming her father was about to make some announcement that would further establish her importance and success. Madison just called her future sister-in-law pathetic for being a teacher who lives modestly and dedicates her career to serving students who face significant challenges, Richard continued, his tone conversational but carrying an edge that T suggested he was building toward something significant. "Before anyone agrees with that assessment, there's something you all need to know about Claire Morrison." I'd felt my stomach drop. Richard was about to discuss something that I'd shared with him in confidence, something I'd asked him not to reveal to Madison or anyone else in the family because I hadn't wanted my private financial situation to become public knowledge or family obligation. So, 3 days ago, Claire came to my office for a meeting I'd requested through my attorney, Richard said, looking directly at Madison as he spoke. "I'd been searching for a lead donor to fund a new program at the foundation, a literacy initiative that will provide books, tutoring, and educational support to students in under-resourced Boston public schools. The program budget is $2.50 million over 5 years, and we've been struggling to find donors willing to commit to education rather than the more glamorous charitable causes." The room remained silent, everyone processing why Richard was discussing foundation business during his daughter's engagement celebration. Madison's pleased expression had shifted to confusion. "Claire donated $2.50 million to fund the entire program," Richard continued, his words landing like bombs across the dinner tables. $2.5 million from the middle school teacher who lives in a studio apartment and shops at discount stores because she directs the majority of her income toward causes she believes in rather than lifestyle she doesn't need." The silence was absolute. 38 guests, processing information that completely contradicted everything Madison had just said about pathetic career choices and lack of ambition. "Where did a teacher get $2.50 million? Someone finally asked, voicing the question everyone was thinking. "From the settlement she received 7 years ago when a drunk driver killed her fiancé," Richard replied, his voice carrying genuine respect rather than the pity that usually accompanied references to tragedy. "Claire was engaged to Daniel Chen, a software engineer who was on his way to their apartment when he was hit by a driver who'd been drinking. The driver's insurance company, combined with a civil lawsuit settlement, paid Claire $3.80 in compensation for Daniel's death and her own injuries that required 18 months of physical therapy. I'd never discussed the settlement. He publicly never told anyone except my immediate family about the amount, never wanted to be defined by money. I'd received in exchange for losing the person I'd planned to marry. The settlement had felt like blood money, compensation for something that no amount of wealth could replace. Claire could have retired at 25, Richard continued. She could have lived luxuriously on investment returns. Instead, she completed her master's in education, took a teaching position paying $52,000 annually, and spent the past 7 years living on her teacher's salary, while investing the settlement funds and directing investment returns towards heritable causes she researched carefully and supported strategically. Richard paused, his eyes moving from Madison to the guests who'd laughed at her mockery to Ryan, who'd remained silent while his fiancée publicly humiliated his sister. Over the past 7 years, Claire has donated over $4 million to organizations serving at-risk youth, literacy programs, education initiatives, and services supporting students who face poverty, trauma, and systemic barriers. She's done this anonymously, requesting that recipients not publicize her contributions because she didn't want recognition, she just wanted to help. Type anonymous if you believe the best giving happens without an audience. Claire had been supporting the work while Madison was mocking the worker. The silence had shifted from shock to something that felt like collective shame. 38 people who laughed at Madison's mockery now understand that the pathetic teacher in the discount dress had contributed more to society than everyone in the room combined, and had done so while living modestly and working dia illy with the students who benefited from her hidden philanthropy. Madison's face had gone from confident to white, her expression cycling through confusion, shock, and dawning horror as she processed what her father had just revealed. Her mockery of my pathetic life choices had just been exposed in front of everyone she'd invited to celebrate her engagement. "But Dad, how did you even know about Claire's?" Madison's voice was shaky, trying to understand how this information had emerged. "Because I sit on the board of 3 organizations that received major anonymous donations over the past 7 years, and I make it my business to know who's funding important work," Richard replied, his tone suggesting disappointment in his daughter's values rather than pride. "In her engagement. When I discovered Claire was the anonymous donor, I reached out to thank her. We've been meeting quarterly for the past 3 years to discuss strategic philanthropy and effective giving." He'd turned to address me directly, his expression apologetic. "Claire, I'm sorry to break your anonymity without permission. But watching my daughter publicly mock you for choosing meaningful work and modest living, while you've been quietly funding the kind of initiatives that actually change lives, I couldn't let that cruelty stand without correction." The room remained silent as guests processed not just the revelation about my hidden wealth and strategic philanthropy, but Richard Lancaster's obvious respect for my choices and his barely concealed disappointment in his daughter's behavior. Ryan had finally found his voice, though it came out strangled with shock. "Claire, why didn't you tell us about any of this? Mom and Dad don't know you've been donating millions to charity." "Because the point of giving isn't recognition," I'd replied quietly, speaking for the first time since Madison's mockery. "The point is supporting work that matters. I don't need credit for writing checks. I need students to have books and tutoring and opportunities they wouldn't have otherwise." My mother had started crying, not from pride but from what looked like shame mixed with belated understanding. "Claire, honey, we've been treating you like a failure because you live modestly and work at a public school. We had no idea. You had no idea because you never asked what I valued or why I made the choices I made," I had interrupted gently. "You assumed modest living meant insufficient ambition rather than deliberate priority setting. You measured success by lifestyle rather than impact. Drop measured if you understand that success looks different, depending on what you actually value." Madison had been using the wrong metrics entirely. The formal toasts that followed Richard's revelation were the most uncomfortable I'd ever witnessed. Ryan's boss had attempted to toast the couple's future success, but his words about building wealth and status rang hollow after Richard's disclosure about actual impact and meaningful contribution. Madison's mother, Catherine, had tried to toast her daughter's achievements, but her references to Madison's career at Lancaster Development felt empty compared to discussion of anonymous multi-million-dollar donations funding literacy programs. Madison herself had been unable to deliver the toast she'd prepared, something about surrounding ourselves with people who understand success and ambition. The words would have been devastating after her father's revelation about who actually Lily understood meaningful achievement. The evening had ended early, with guests leaving more quickly than usual after engagement dinners, many stopping to speak with me briefly, some apologizing for laughing at Madison's mockery, others expressing admiration for my work and my kooky yet philanthropy, several asking how they could support the literacy initiative Richard had mentioned. Richard had pulled me aside as guests were departing, his expression mixing apology and something that looked like paternal concern. "Claire, I hope you'll forgive me for breaking your anonymity. But I've watched Madison develop attitudes about wealth and success that worry me deeply, and watching her publicly mock you for choosing meaningful work over maximum lifestyle, I couldn't let it stand." "You didn't need to defend me, Mr. Lancaster de Richard, please. And yes, I did need to defend you. My daughter has been raised with privilege she didn't earn, and she's confused inherited wealth with personal achievement. She needed to understand the difference between people who consume wealth and people who deploy it strategically to address problems that actually matter." He'd paused, clearly struggling with something. "I'm not sure this engagement should proceed." Madison's mockery of "You revealed character flaws I can't ignore," and Ryan's silence while his fiancée publicly humiliated his sister tells me he's not the man I thought he was when he asked for her hand. The comment had been surprising, not just because Richard D was questioning his daughter's engagement, but because he was acknowledging that the evening had revealed truths about both Madison and Ryan that couldn't be unseen or ignored. The aftermath of the engagement dinner transformed multiple relationships and exposed assumptions that had been governing family dynamics for years. Madison had called me the day after the dinner, her voice carrying emotions I couldn't quite identify. Humiliation, anger, confusion, and something that might have been grudging recognition that she'd been completely wrong. About me. Claire, I owe you an apology. I've been judging your life choices without understanding what you were actually doing or why you made the decisions you made. My father hasn't spoken to me since the dinner except to say he's ashamed of the person I've become. The apology had been awkward and clearly difficult, but it represented more self-awareness than I'd expected from someone who'd publicly called me pathetic 12 hours earlier. Madison, the problem wasn't just that you mocked me. The problem is that you've developed a worldview where success means maximum consumption and visible wealth, rather than meaningful contribution and strategic impact. Your father's disappointed because he built considerable wealth and apparently hoped you'd understand it as a tool for addressing problems rather than just funding a luxury lifestyle. We'd talked for an hour about values, success metrics, and the difference between inheriting privilege and earning respect. The conversation hadn't transformed Madison overnight, but it had created space for her to question assumptions she'd developed about what actually mattered and how to measure worthwhile life choices. Ryan's response had been more complicated and revealing. He'd come to my apartment 2 days after the dinner, his expression mixing shock with something that looked like shame. Claire, I don't even know where to start. I've been treating you like an embarrassment because you chose teaching over a corporate career, and it turns out you've been doing more meaningful work and contributing more to society than I ever have despite earning 5 times your salary. Ryan, this isn't about comparing our contributions. It's about understanding that different choices can be equally valid, and that modest lifestyle doesn't automatically mean insufficient ambition or achievement. We'd talked for 3 hours about career paths, value systems, and the ways out. Our family had developed narratives about success that prioritized visible consumption over actual impact. Ryan had admitted that his high salary came with 80-hour work weeks, constant stress, and the nagging awareness that his consulting work primarily helped wealthy corporations become wealthier, rather than addressing problems that actually mattered. I make $280,000 plus bonuses and I hate my job, he'd finally admitted. You make $58,000 and you love your students and you're funding literacy programs that change kids' lives. Who's actually successful in that comparison? The question had been rhetorical but significant, Ryan recognizing that he'd been measuring success by the wrong metrics and missing what actually created meaningful life satisfaction. Comment metrics if you believe we often measure success by visibility rather than impact. Ryan had been keeping score wrong for a decade. My parents' response revealed assumptions they'd maintained about both their children and about what constituted worthwhile life choices. Mom had come to my apartment 3 days after the dinner, her face showing the kind of emotional processing that comes from discovering you fundamentally misjudged someone you thought you understood. Claire, I've spent years feeling disappointed that you chose teaching over more lucrative career options. I've apologized to friends for your modest lifestyle. I've treated your career like a phase you'd outgrow rather than a deliberate choice backed by values and resources I never knew you had. We'd spent hours discussing the settlement money, my decision to live on my teaching salary, the strategic philanthropy I'd been conducting anonymously for 7 years, and why I'd never told them about any of it. I didn't tell you because I didn't want the money to change how you treated me, or how I saw myself, I'd explained. Daniel's death gave me financial security I never asked for and didn't want. Using that money to support meaningful work while living the life I'd have lived anyway felt like the only way to honor his memory without letting tragedy define my entire identity. Mom had cried, genuine tears of recognition that she'd been measuring her daughter's worth by external markers of success rather than actual character and contribution. I've been a terrible mother. I should have celebrated your teaching and your commitment to students who need advocates. Instead, I was embarrassed that you weren't wealthy and socially prominent. The conversation had been painful but necessary, forcing both of us to examine assumptions about success, family support, and what actually mattered when measuring worthwhile life choices. The most surprising outcome had been Richard Lancaster's continued involvement in my philanthropic work and his growing respect for my approach to strategic giving. We'd continued our quarterly meetings, discussing effective altruism, education policy, and the ways wealth could be deployed to address systemic problems rather than just treating symptoms. "Claire, you're the kind of philanthropist every foundation wishes they could find," Richard had told me during one of these meetings. "You research carefully, give strategically, measure impact rather than just writing checks. And you do it all anonymously because you care about results rather than recognition. That's extraordinarily rare among major donors." He'd also shared that his relationship with Madison had been fundamentally changed by the engagement dinner revelation. "I've been funding her lifestyle without examining whether that privilege was developing character or undermining it. Watching her mock you for choosing meaningful work, that was a wake-up call about the person I've inadvertently raised." Richard had reduced Madison's discretionary income, required her to take genuine responsibility at Lancaster Developments, rather than treating her position as sinecure, and insisted she become involved in the foundation's literacy initiative to understand the work being funded by the donation she'd mocked. Type character: if you believe the best parents adjust when they discover their approach isn't developing the values they actually want to instill, Richard was doing the hard work of course correction. Madison and Ryan's engagement had survived but transformed significantly. Madison had started volunteering with the literacy program funded by my donation, spending Saturday mornings working with struggling readers at the same middle school where I taught. The work had been humbling and eye-opening for someone who'd never spent time in under-resourced public schools or worked directly with students who faced poverty and trauma. "These kids work so hard," Madison had said after her third tutoring session, her voice carrying genuine emotion rather than the performative sympathy wealthy people sometimes express about disadvantaged populations. "They're reading years below grade level not because they're lazy but because they've never had books at home or adults who could help them develop literacy skills. I had no idea how much privilege affected even basic academic achievement." The recognition had been significant, Madison beginning to understand that her own success had been built on advantages she'd never examined or appreciated, and that judging others for having less without understanding systemic barriers was both cruel and ignorant. Ryan had made similar changes, reducing his hours at the consulting firm and using freed time to volunteer at my school as a math tutor. He'd also started questioning the work he was doing professionally, and whether helping wealthy corporations optimize profits was how he wanted to spend the majority of his waking hours. "I think I've been chasing salary and status without asking whether the work itself was meaningful or worthwhile," he'd admitted after 6 months of tutoring. "These kids need so much support, and I've been spending 80 hours weekly helping billion-dollar companies make marginally more money. What's the point of high salary if the work doesn't actually matter?" The question had been the beginning of a longer journey for Ryan, one that would eventually lead to career changes that prioritized meaning over maximum compensation. 3 years after the engagement dinner, Madison and Ryan are married and living differently than either of them anticipated when they'd planned their wedding. They'd dramatically scaled back the celebration Madison had originally envisioned, choosing a smaller ceremony and directing the money they'd have spent on an elaborate wedding toward the Literacy Foundation. Madison works full-time at Lancaster Development, but dedicates 20 hours weekly to foundation work and educational advocacy. Ryan left consulting to take a position at a nonprofit focusing on economic opportunity for low-income families, accepting a 60% pay cut and discovering that work satisfaction matters more than salary optimization. "I'm still teaching 7th grade English at Martin Luther King Jr. Middle School, still living in a modest apartment in Somerville, still directing investment returns from the settlement toward causes I research carefully and support strategically. My total charitable giving over the past decade has exceeded $6.50 million, all directed toward education, youth services and programs addressing poverty and systemic barriers. The literacy initiative funded by my donation has served over 3,000 students across 15 Boston public schools, providing books, tutoring and educational support that has measurably improved reading proficiency and academic confidence. The program has become a model for other cities, demonstrating that strategic investment in literacy can generate significant returns in student achievement and life outcomes. But the most valuable outcome of the engagement dinner revelation wasn't the charitable impact or the changed family dynamics, it was the clarity it provided about the difference between success that's visible and success that's meaningful. Madison had measured success by wealth, status, and lifestyle that signaled achievement to observers. She'd mocked my modest living and teaching career because they didn't generate visible markers of success that could be displayed or discussed at social gatherings. But she'd been measuring success by consumption rather than contribution, by visibility rather than impact, by lifestyle rather than values expressed through strategic action. The engagement dinner had forced her, and everyone present, to reckon with the gap between what they claimed to value and how they actually measured worth. It had exposed assumptions about career prestige, lifestyle importance, and the metrics that actually indicate meaningful life choices. Tell me about a time when someone judged you for choices they didn't understand, or when you discovered that modest living masked significant impact. How did that experience change your understanding of success? And what would you say to someone who's being mocked for choosing meaningful work over maximum salary?